Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michala. I'm speaking to you from the Faculty of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'd like to welcome you to today's seminar. As of Wednesday, we had 64 people from around the world who'd registered, and I think that number's gone up slightly in the meantime. So next slide, please, Vivian. Okay, so before I introduce our speaker, Michala Meiselles, let me just deal with a few housekeeping points. First of all, that we've muted microphones, to avoid background noise coming through. And then how we plan to run the session like this, that Michala has prepared a presentation explaining who's eligible to apply for Senior Fellowship of the HEA and the process of going about it. By the way, I'm assuming you know what Senior Fellowship of the HEA means, or fellowship. They are internationally recognized accreditation for higher education teachers. So Michala is going to speak to you about that. And then, if time permits, I've got a few questions, which unless Michala's covered them already in her presentation, I'd just like to interview her about if there's time. And then I throw it over to you, to everybody to ask questions. In terms of how to ask questions, if you look at, once the slides have disappeared, once we've stopped sharing the screen, then you'll see at the bottom of your screen a chat box, looking like the chat box you see here. What we'd like you to do, please, is to type your questions into that chat box, and then Vivian Chen, my colleague, or I would then see the questions and put those questions to Michala. Today's event will be recorded, so if you're feeling shy, you don't want to be seen, then I suggest switching your camera off, and we'll make the recording available later. Also, Michala has kindly agreed that we can make these slides available. So we'll put these slides onto the CUHK Law Learning Matters website. And later, we'll put the link for that website also into the chat box. Next slide, please, Vivian. And the next slide, please. So just to tell you a little bit about Michala Meiselles. So Michala is a senior lecturer in the Derby Law School in the University of Derby in the United Kingdom. She's also a visiting professor in the Université Jean Moulin in Lyon. In fact, Michala is speaking to us from Lyon, or from France anyway. And before moving to Derby, Michala was an associate professor in that university. She's also held other visiting professorships in universities in France and the United States. Michala is a qualified solicitor in England and Wales with experience in private practice and working for a local authority. Michala's research, teaching, consultancy in the fields of banking, compliance, cross-border commercial agreements, technology transfer and licensing. Next slide, please, Vivian. And we can see here some of the books and articles that Michala has written. Michala has published books on international licensing agreements and international commercial agreements. But as we saw from the previous slide, in November 2018, Michala became a senior fellow of the HEA. And it's that experience that we'd like to hear about from you now, please, Michala.
Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for coming along. And I'll try to answer as many questions as possible during the course of our conversation together. So I'm going to talk firstly about who should apply as a senior fellow of the HEA. Thank you, Vivian. So really, the senior fellowship is actually focused on experienced academics who have experience teaching students or supporting the teaching of students. But the main requirement for senior fellowship is to actually demonstrate two components, and those are you need to demonstrate a sustained impact beyond your group, your team, to a college level or an institutional level, and also an influence on learning and teaching at the college or institutional level or even further afield. So one other criterion that they do mention for senior fellowship is external influence. So they do say that the external influence is relevant. So if you can actually show once again, this effectively demonstrate that you have experience in teaching and learning, either directly or indirectly through a support role. And on top of that, you must demonstrate sustained impact and influence beyond your team to a college level, an institutional level, or a subject level. And even better, external influence is also going to be critical to the application process. So when I talk about the case studies very shortly, this is the focus for you. So reading through my old case studies in preparation for today, yes, I mean, the focus wasn't on the teaching, it was on the impact and influence. Now, there is a limited number of words to each application. So to each case study, the 2 case studies, the application, there's a word cap. So the trick really for you is to, as we'll see very shortly, identify impact and influence primarily, and really focus your application on that impact and influence in your case studies and your application generally. Okay, thank you, Vivian. If we could move on, thank you. So effectively, senior fellowship is very much about making sure that you meet the criteria that we're going to be talking about very shortly. So you need to demonstrate a significant responsibility for leadership, management, organization of a module or a program. And you need to, for example, demonstrate influence and impact through, for example, the mentoring or supporting of colleagues who are new perhaps to teaching, influencing maybe your department or more widely the institution through some type of advisory role. So I'm going to talk about examples as we go along, and I'll go back to the case studies that I used in order to demonstrate the criteria that I just mentioned. If we could move on, please, Vivian. Thank you. So how would one apply for senior fellowship? If we could move on, thank you. So the application, so I've used the word application to refer to the whole document that you supply in support of your application. So the application consists of many different parts. The first part of the application is going to be what they call in the HEA an account of your professional practice, and this is actually made up of 2 main components: the reflective account, the RAP, and then your case studies, your 2 case studies. And also, beyond the AAP, you will also need to provide 2 supporting statements from 2 referees, and we're going to talk about those supporting statements shortly. There's also a fee involved with the application process, and that's £600, UK pounds. If we could move on, please, Vivian. Thank you. Now, when you're going through the process of applying, beyond the need to identify impact and influence, as you are completing your application, it's very important that you make sure you have in front of you a copy of the areas of activity, the core knowledge categories, and the professional values, along with the descriptors. D3, descriptor 3 are the ones that apply to senior fellowship applications. So what I would recommend you do is you print out the document itself. It's only 1 page long. I've got it in front of me myself here, because it was actually within my pack. And effectively, just show the screen, there are 5 areas of activity. There are 6 areas of core knowledge categories, and then there are 4 areas of professional values. And throughout your application form, the important thing is to make sure that each time you refer to an activity, in a bracket after the sentence, you denote which specific standards from the UK PSF are applicable to that sentence. because as you're going along, you need to demonstrate that you satisfy these various dimensions of the professional standards. Now, the 5 areas of activity that I just showed you that you can print off the HEA website effectively demonstrate in total that you have undertaken teaching, supporting, and facilitating of learning in the higher educational sector. And in the context of A1, which is area of activity 1, effectively they're talking about the design and the planning of the learning activity. In A2, you're talking about teaching. The teaching is not mandatory, because if you can demonstrate supporting of learning, that too would satisfy the A2 standard. A3 is talking about assessing students and providing feedback. And A4 is talking about developing a learning environment and an approach to the support of students in their learning activities. So that would include, for example, support, pastoral care. It could include, for example, career advice. Core knowledge, so those are the K1 to K6 areas. These need to be carried out in relation to the various areas of activity, namely A1 to A5. And the core knowledge, so K1 would talk about knowledge of a subject matter. So for example, you're teaching a module on, for example, in my case, I teach banking law. And in the context of banking law, we look at compliance and money laundering. So by delivering the subject, you're demonstrating K1. K2 talks about the methods of teaching and learning, and K3 talks about how students learn. K4 is very much about using and improving the learning technologies that you are using. And K5 talks about evaluation of teaching, and K6 talks about quality assurance. So the 5 areas of activity tie together with the knowledge categories. So you must link K1 to 6 to A1 to 5. And on top of those 2 sets of criteria, you will also obviously need to satisfy the professional value categories, which are V1 to V4. So V1 is very much about respect for diverse learning communities. V2 is talking about equality of opportunity for learners. And V3 is talking about evidence-informed approaches. And V5 is very much about acknowledging the wider context. So all those categories of standards must be demonstrated alongside the descriptors, so D3. So the descriptors are the descriptors that one would need to satisfy in order to apply for senior fellowship. If we could move on, please, Vivian. Thank you. So throughout my application, in the case studies and in the APP, I obviously always made sure that I went back to the standards that we've just spoken about and linked it up to the descriptors D3. So in the APP, obviously, because it's your testimony, it's your evidence, the document is actually written in first person because it is a personal account of your own work. Now, in your reflective documents within the APP, one important thing that I would say is make sure that you include illustrations. Provide actual illustrations of the work you've done that shows impact and influence. Now, the impact and influence doesn't necessarily just have to come from education. It could come from a wider context. For example, developing a program, internationalizing a department, sitting on an academic board for the university, building up a community that is larger, goes beyond the university, so working with stakeholders outside the university. All those are examples of how you influence others. In your reflective account, beyond the examples, very important to think about the milestones in your career. How did you get into education, for example? When Where and when did you decide to go into teaching? When and where did you assume a role that involved impact and influence? One of the best pieces of advice I received during my writing process was the advice from my colleague Chris, who said to me, think about the challenges that you had to contend with in your case studies. So think about what challenges you had to contend with and how you actually overcame your challenges. And this really helps you flesh out your illustrations within your case study. The reflective account also allows you to contextualize the two case studies, to effectively set out the background to those two case studies. Another thing that I included within my reflective account was my teaching philosophy, because my teaching philosophy is relevant to both the case studies. So when I talked about my teaching philosophy, I'd identified the critical tools that I use within my teaching that I've developed over the years. So in that context, I looked at experiential teaching. I also looked at the Socratic method, and I also touched upon blended teaching, which is relevant because a lot of our teaching is done from a distance, particularly now with COVID-19. If we could move on, please, Vivian. Thank you. So the case studies, as I said, really link back to the reflective account that I just mentioned. As I said, once again, the reflective account is very much about building up the context to the case studies. So really setting out the chronology that led up to you assuming a role that involved impact and influence. So in the two case studies, really the focus is on the impact. The focus isn't necessarily on the teaching per se, it's on how your teaching and learning environment has an impact beyond your department, on other colleagues in other departments or colleagues at other universities, or perhaps the stakeholders that we referred to earlier on within the larger community. So for me, the two case studies really focused on those two important aspects, impact and influence. So there has to be a significant impact and influence, and it must be sustained. Obviously, the case studies must also address the standards that we refer to within the framework, and also address obviously the important criteria, the descriptor 3 elements that are critical to the senior fellowship application. Examples that you could perhaps think about in terms of your case study is, have you, for example, developed a dynamic teaching environment? Have you worked on developing that dynamic teaching environment? What impacted on your development process? How has that environment, how is your teaching environment impacted on others within your department and your university? So for example, if you are involved in a mentoring scheme beyond your department, if you are helping others by peer reviewing their research and their teaching activities, those could potentially be important case studies. If we could move on, please, Vivian. So beyond the two case studies and the reflective account that make up the core of your application, obviously you also need to provide two supporting statements. Those two supporting statements must come from peers, because the senior fellowship application process is based on peer recognition of your work. So your referee must be able to confirm your account in your application. They must be familiar with your work. So they must be people who have worked alongside you for a period of time. They must be able to confirm your experience and the fact that you have satisfied the standards within the framework. So when the statements were sent out to my referees, I helped prepare the statement. So I prepared the draft statement. Once again, within the draft statement that I prepared, I linked my account in the statement up to the standards within the framework. So at the end of each sentence, I made a note in the brackets of whether or not it related to A1, K2, D31. The statement provided by your referee beyond the fact that it confirms your experience and comments on the examples that you've provided in your application should also flag any achievements that you have managed to achieve. Okay, if we could move on, please. Thank you. Right, so who can be a referee? As I said, it is a peer recognition of private practice. So your referee must really be a person who has expertise in higher education, teaching and learning. Once again, they have to have worked alongside you, either in the past or at the present time, and they must have first-hand knowledge of your work because they must comment on and confirm your record of effectiveness within the context where you are teaching. They must have current HE work experience or recent HE work experience. And one of the requirements is that they usually should hold a HEA fellowship. But one point to make there is it's not essential. In fact, my first case study was about my work in France, and the HEA doesn't exist per se here in France. To be honest, I'd never heard of the HEA until I moved to the UK after working here for 15 years. So in fact, my first case study was supported by a colleague here in the law school in Lyon. And we're going to very briefly talk about the review process. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So during the review process, effectively, in our case, the review was carried out internally because we're an accredited institution at Derby. And the review process was carried out by a committee of peers within the university, made up of individuals from different departments. And they actually reviewed my application and the supporting statements that I had provided. Incidentally, the supporting statements I had to prepare well in advance. I sent them through to my referees. My referees had time to reflect on the supporting statements, revise them, add to them, discuss them with me before signing and returning the final version. So your application must be ready together with the supporting statements, and everything must be provided either internally to your accreditation team, or alternatively, if you have no accredited team internally, to the HEA directly. Thank you. So in terms of a roadmap, I've been trying to think quite a bit about how I would go about, if I were doing this again, how would I do it? So one thing I'm going to chat about later is how long it took. It takes a long time, and I think you can actually perhaps reduce the amount of time it takes you by really focusing on the experiences that show impact and influence. Once you have a clear idea for your case studies about the impact and the influence that you've had on others, and you can start charting those out, then I would go back and write the reflective account. Because remember, the reflective account is very much about the context to your case studies. So start with the case studies and then work on your reflective account. And once you've identified your case studies, you can also think about who's going to be your referee. So who do you know who can actually attest to the value of your work? Thank you. In terms of resources, well, Professor Lower and I were speaking about this, and perhaps the main book to start off with is Biggs and Tang. I would go to Biggs and Tang. I found Bloom extremely useful as well. His taxonomy on education was instrumental in my account. So definitely the key resources there are Biggs and Tang. And then I've given you an assortment of other resources that I used, for example, in support of my case studies when I was talking about feedback, and in support of my reflective account when I was talking about my teaching philosophy. So a lot of the literature review went into the reflective account when I was talking about my teaching philosophy, and also went into the case studies when I was talking about how my teaching and my work had an impact on others. So the focus of my account really was all about feedback, Socratic method, experiential teaching and the value of experiential teaching, improving systems of evaluation. I also talked about learning environments. So I talked about VLEs, virtual learning environments, and the types of virtual learning environments that I'd used and adapted for teaching. I also talked in the context of my first case study about how we set up a distance learning structure within the university. And in that context, we talked, well, in this context, I actually talked a lot about how distance learning operates and what type of tools you can use. And in support of my discussion, I used quite a bit of literature from the list. Thank you. Thanks, Vivian. I've given you here probably the main link, because there's quite a lot of documents on the HEA website, but this is the link that I would start off by using. It takes you directly to the site that gives you an overview of senior fellowship. Once you are familiar with this guidance and the template documents, I think then it's probably best to go off and read the other stuff. But this main portal really is the most important portal. Thank you, Vivian. So I know that Professor Lower has an event coming up very shortly, but he'll be talking about that later on. And I'm looking forward to this event. It's in June, well, in a week's time, and it's basically looking at legal education. So it's going to be a great event, and I hope you can join us and Professor Lower and his team there as well. I think Professor Lower is going to ask me a couple of questions now, and then we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A. Thank you.
Yes. And so I think, Vivian, you stopped sharing this. You stopped sharing the slides. So now do you see the chat box has appeared at the bottom of the screen? So that if you've got any questions for Michala, do please put them into that chat box anytime you like now. And later on, as I say, we're also going to put into that chat box the link to the site where you'll be able to get the slides later and to the recording. Now, actually, Michala, before I ask the questions, though, one thing perhaps we should clarify is that today you've been talking about senior fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
That is where you can show you're an experienced teacher, and the distinctive feature is that you've had an impact on other teachers.
Yes.
And that's what you've been talking about. But there are other grades of fellowship. So there's associate fellowship and fellowship, which are more relevant to younger teachers and where the or people who support teaching and learning, and where the focus is much more on the impact you've had on learners. Have you helped learners to learn? But we're talking about, you've been talking about senior fellowship because you had more experience, and so the focus is on how you've helped other teachers to teach better, really. So that I just wanted to clarify that. But now, Michala, the first question I was going to ask is, why did you apply for senior fellowship?
In fact, it was very indirect for me. It was circuitous because, in fact, when I started to apply, I applied for fellowship. When I joined my university, when I returned to the UK after 15 years in France teaching here, one of the requirements within my institution is that academic staff have a fellowship of the HEA. So I started drafting my fellowship application, and when I spoke to my colleagues in learning and development, they told me that it might be better to try for senior fellowship. So that's how I got into the application process indirectly.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not true in Hong Kong yet, but I think it is much more true in England.
Absolutely.
There's an expectation sometimes that you do, and Australia as well, I know, there's more of an expectation that you've got fellowship or senior fellowship.
Absolutely. And in fact, when you're applying for jobs, it's one of the requirements. It's one of the desirable criteria, really, in any job spec here in the United Kingdom. Well, sorry, I'm in France now, but back in the UK.
And then you already mentioned this earlier in your presentation, but it took you a long time. So perhaps we could drill into that. How long did it take you? How much work is involved?
It's a good question. Thank you, Michael. Effectively, because I applied for, was thinking of applying for fellowship first, I started filling out the fellowship application, and that probably took me 6 months. And then the actual application for senior fellowship took me roughly 12 months. So in total, it took me 15 months. And in terms of time commitment, I'd probably say it took me a day a week, especially at the beginning when you're writing your case studies. It's very time consuming. Obviously, during the year, as you recall information, you add and supplement your case study. So I'd say a day a week. Allow yourself a day a week over, if you really want to do it thoroughly, I'd probably say over a 12 to 15 month period.
So it's pretty serious job.
It really is. I treated it almost like writing an article for a journal. Because in terms of time, it really does demand a lot of your time.
And what support did you get?
I'm very lucky. My university have a fantastic team in learning and development who really helped me with the application process, helped me with the drafting process, commented on my application and case studies as I was going along. So that was very, very helpful. And as I said, the main piece of advice they gave me, which I found critical, was ask yourself what challenges you face when you're talking about your case studies.
And then, well, let's talk about the case studies, because you mentioned you had 2 of them.
I did.
You told us what they were.
I think the first case study was the easiest one to think about, because that was talking retrospectively about my work here in Lyon. And that really was about when I created the LLM program in my university here at Université Jean Moulin, where I'm still visiting prof. That talked about creating an LLM program in an environment where teaching in English didn't exist. Until our LLM program was created, we didn't have a dedicated program in English. The challenge there was obviously convincing the Senate of the university to validate the program. And there was quite a bit of opposition there because it was going to be an English taught program. And here in France, French is a very important environment within the higher education system. So that was a critical challenge. So there was no problem at all about talking about impact there, because the moment the program was up and running, it had a tremendous impact within the university. It created a snowball effect. So shortly after the LLM was introduced, there was an MBA program as well that was introduced into the business school, again taught in English exclusively. And since the LLM program was launched back in 2008, there's many other LLMs, there's a handful of other LLMs that have been created throughout France. So actually it did really create quite an impact. So the case study, my first case study was actually called Trailblazer Programs. And by calling it Trailblazer Programs, I'm inferring that it had an impact and influence institutionally and wider as well. And in that context, if I have a look at my case study, I've divided it up into sections. And in each section, I've talked about a distinct element that shows impact and influence. So in case study 1, in the preamble, so in the chapeau at the top, I've spoken very briefly about the context and how this program is instrumental to the higher education sector within the university and elsewhere. And then I've divided it up into sections, and in each section I've provided an illustration of a challenge and how we overcame it. So in case study 1, I talk about module development, coaching of junior members of staff. So I actually, within the case study, talk about various aspects of my work that had impact and influence on others. I talked about assessment, evaluation, and program development. And within each section, as I said, I provided 1 or 2 illustrations with a challenge and how we overcame it. Or in my case, how I overcame it, because obviously it's first person. Case study 2 is a current case study. So it's talking about my work at the moment. It talks about my work at the University of Derby, and I've actually given the name to that case study, Influencing Others at the University of Derby. And again, once again, within the case study, I've divided it up into distinct sections, and each section has a topic and an illustration or two illustrations. Within each illustration, I provide a challenge and the methodology that I employed in order to overcome the challenge. So in case study number 2, I've talked about different functions that I have that impact and influence others. So I talk about my work as module leader on the undergrad and postgrad programs. I talk about my internal and external moderation work. And I also talk about how I assist others within the university. And I also talk quite a bit about my work as a representative for my college on the academic board. So yeah, one is an old case study. The other is a new case study. So you really need to show sustained impact and influence. So it has to be ongoing. You can have a case study from the past, but you also have to have a case study from the present.
And comparing those two case studies, so the first case study was all about one thing, the English-speaking LLM, whereas
Yes.
the second one is like a range of things that you do, like moderation, being on the advisory board and so on.
Indeed. Yeah, I think in order to not have to revisit your application or case study, I think it's very important to cover as much as possible. And that's why the case studies are a moving activity. They're an ongoing activity throughout the year. As you come across something that you believe has an impact or influence, add it into your case study and flesh it out. Give examples, concrete examples of how you achieved that bit of impact or influencing. Did you have a challenge, and how did you overcome the challenge? How did you assist or coach a colleague?
You mentioned that as part of your account, you had a teaching philosophy.
Yes.
And I think that's really worth talking a lot about, because I mean, even when you're applying for a teaching job, you need a teaching philosophy. And then, as I understand it, for things like senior fellowship, your teaching philosophy in a way incorporates your values, and it's what drives everything else. So you're going to be repeatedly referring to your teaching philosophy. Is that true, do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely, Professor Loa. Teaching philosophy it's the oxygen that breathes life into your teaching mechanism, your methodology. So your teaching philosophy, the cornerstones of your teaching activity. And it's something I would say personally that I've worked upon throughout my academic career. When I think about Socratic method, obviously the Socratic method is used a lot in the Anglo-Saxon system, but further afield as well. I mean, I've come across the Socratic method when I went to Hong Kong to work there as a consultant. This idea of creating an ongoing dialogue with your student body and encouraging your students to have a dialogue amongst themselves, especially on the LLM program when we're talking about Islamic finance or compliance. Yeah, it's very important to get the students to talk amongst themselves and with you, so that they start developing critical analysis tools and also the original thought, because both critical analysis and original thought are imperative, obviously not only within the academic sphere, but beyond within the professional context and also personally within one's life. So yeah, the Socratic method is a staple of my teaching philosophy. And then the other component that I would probably say is critical is the experiential teaching, the workshops. I will always remember back in the 90s when I graduated from Manchester that the main thing for the Magic Circle firms was transferable skills, interpersonal skills, the ability to use the theory in practice. So yeah, that always became, for me, a very important motive in my teaching. So I created case studies that I've worked upon for the past 15 years, dealing with commercial negotiations within the legal context. And a lot of my work is actually inspired by Harvard Business School and the case studies that we use in negotiation modules from Harvard Business School.
I think, as I understand it, when we were talking about your teaching philosophy, it's got two parts. It's kind of your statement of the things that you think are important to your teaching practice, like experiential learning. So it's got that sort of account of your teaching values, but it's
Yes.
backed up by theory. And this,
Mm-hmm.
that's right, isn't it? That's why you showed us the
Yes.
key texts and the selected literature, because
Yes.
you are expected to refer to educational theory.
Absolutely. In fact, the Socratic method is used not only within law, but within the legal context. Many attribute it to a dean of Harvard Law School, Langdalian. They call it the Langdalian system. So Langdell was a dean at Harvard Business School who actually, in a sense, started to use, I think it was back in the 1930s, the Socratic method within the context of his teaching on contract law. So he was using it to discuss cases, so actual cases. I've just taken it beyond the cases because I use it with my cases anyway. So when we're talking about case law, I will ask the students to recite the facts, talk about the rationale, we'll get a discussion going on the context. But I've actually used it beyond, because I use interdisciplinary teaching, especially within banking. We talk a lot about Adam Smith, Ricardo, and many other philosophers who are influential on law and economics. So yeah, the Socratic method really does, in a sense, cross over to other disciplines. So yeah, the text, the literature that I refer to is a sample of the bibliography that I used. And yes, quite a bit of it does talk about the Socratic method and experiential teaching. Yes, it's important that you review the relevant literature within your case studies and in your reflective account. So as I said, within your reflective account, try to talk about the context of your case studies in maybe half a page, and talk about your teaching philosophy. I'd probably spend 2 or 3 pages talking about your teaching philosophy and providing the literature review within that account of your teaching philosophy. If you can, add some more literature review into your case studies. But again, the word limit is really hard to manage. I ended up writing about 12,000 words, and I had to cut it down to 6,000 words. So the challenge there is really making sure that the bits that you've included within your application and case studies are à point, to the point. Really tick all the boxes that need to be ticked in order to qualify for senior fellowship.
I think so. There's some questions coming through in the chat box. So in a second, we'll move over to those, Michala, if that's okay. I think this is possibly what some people find intimidating, is kind of getting to grips with some literature. And I think that's why you mentioned Biggs and Tang, kind of as a convenient starting textbook to introduce you to some of the educational literature.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think Biggs and Tang are useful. I think the most useful thing for me, and I always smile, I use Google Scholar for my search. Just typing in Socratic method into Google Scholar or experiential teaching, you'll come across a plethora of literature. I mean, there is so much out there. I mean, there's some amazing pieces of work out there that are definitely worth dipping into anyway, whether you're doing your senior fellowship application or not. It's just fun to read that other people out there have confronted the same challenges as you have. And it's informative. That's why I'm looking forward to your conference on legal education. I think it's going to be really informative to learn about what others are doing out there.
Thanks, Michala. See, I know some questions have been coming through. I don't know, Vivian, shall I hand over to you to just deal with the questions that have come through in the chat box?
Okay. I've got a question coming through that's asking Michala, how can someone from African region take benefit of the application? And I sincerely appreciate your beautiful presentation.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I would say that the HEA is very important, obviously, in the United Kingdom, and as we've already heard, in other jurisdictions such as Australia and Hong Kong, of course, and New Zealand as well, and Canada and the United States. So it's definitely important for mobility within the career. I'd probably say it's also perhaps something that's worth introducing elsewhere as a yardstick for educational in a sense, recognition of what you've achieved within your career. So I found it useful for that. I found it useful because, in a sense, it was an acknowledgement from peers that I'd reached a certain point in my career. So it's actually quite a nice feeling, after working as an academic for over 15 years, to get your colleagues, your peers, to recognize the value of your work. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you.
So to all the participants, if you have any question, you can type it and then send it through to me in the chat box.
One thing I'd like to add, actually, just as an afterthought, the case studies, obviously the case studies themselves will differ from one another. And I'd also say the case studies very much differ from person to person. Maybe the best way to really find out how you've impacted others is by asking around, speaking to colleagues within your department, and trying to get a feel for how, in a sense, others perceive you. It could also be useful to speak to perhaps friends who you confide in about your work, whether they're academics or not, to get a feel for how you are perceived. It is a hard process, really, to do in isolation, the senior fellowship. You really need others to be around you, to help you and mentor you, in a sense to reinforce your ideas about how you influence others. So it definitely is a team work, a team effort. One of the things Professor Lower and I talked about when we were preparing for today's presentation is what type of structure could you have around you that will help you with your application process. Having a mentor from your discipline, I would probably say, who's already a senior fellow is critical. Now, when I help others within my team to think about applying for senior fellowship, I know exactly how to zoom in on the bits that they will need within their application and how to get them to build upon those illustrations. So yeah, definitely try to find a mentor who is a senior fellow already within your discipline, so law, for example, or business. But if you can't find somebody within your discipline, then perhaps somebody from another department, once again, who is a senior fellow.
Thank you very much, Ms. Michala. If we do not have any other questions, I'd like to have one last promotion about our upcoming conference. So it is going to be on the 18th to 20th June, starting next Thursday. And if you would like to know more about this conference, you can go to, let me share 1 second. Sorry. You can go to our Learning Matters blog, and then there is a conference page, and you can see the program and also taster videos from the speakers. So you can register for free and very welcome to join the conference. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this seminar today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Vivian. Before we sign off completely, just for people within CUHK, so Michala said it would be good to have a mentor who's already got senior fellowship. Now, we don't have any within our faculty, but within the university, there are already people who've got senior fellowship. So Michala's suggestion about finding people, even if it's from another discipline, would work for us. Great. Well, just before we go, Michala, to say I hope we can have you back again, perhaps to drill into something like the teaching philosophy side of things.
I'd like that very much.
And to say thank you very much indeed for today's excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you, Michael and Vivian, as well. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.